we're taking a look at how existence has a very peculiar quality to it. Whenever energy registers in form, its existentiality is stable because of polarization. If the polarization is shifted so that there's a complementarity established, the form loses its stability and dissolves. And instead of being energy in a form, it becomes dynamic. So there's a curious relationship between form and flow. The form always will come out of the flow, and if it goes back into the flow, it has to lose its form. So that existential things, forms in the universe, fight against losing their stability. And that produces the universal quality of balance, because the balancing, even on level of inorganic minerals, rocks, is always the way in which stability is guarded, is taken care of. The difficulty is that life is not a form, but a flow. So that organic form is caught in a dilemma. Not because of any religion, not because of any doctrine, not because things are not going right. It's concomitant with the way things are. Organic life both is interested in the form being stable, but also sensitive that the reality is that the flow must be free. And so life has this juggling act between energy and dynamic all the time, between form and flow. And when it gets to the complexity of organic beings like ourselves, there is such a interpenetration of layers, of forms that are not statically stable, but are still caught in some process of struggle for balance. And so we have a very odd, chaotic parfait, which we inherit, which is endemic in our life forms. And this is the reason why in our learning, in our education, that we take a lot of time to go through the phases and let the phases have the 3-month, the 12 presentation quality of getting the feel of what that phase is. And when we looked at nature, it was definitely a flow. So that life is very affine to nature. And in fact, everywhere in the world, nature is always personified as a mother, Mother Nature. In Sanskrit, Prakriti, Ma Prakriti, I used to call her. It's always this quality that life and nature are flows, but for us, the flow of life tends to jump into experience, into the mythic horizon, the mythic process, where we feel about things, where we image things, where we language things. And all of experience has a ratcheted up dilemma between form and flow. It shows, for instance, in the genius of Chomsky's transformational grammar work of the 1950s, that there is no way that anyone can expect language, words, to keep their form in the sense of identifications which are permanent. The very way in which languages work are that they jump into flow and reform, and they can do this enormously quickly. And trying to freeze dry a form of language with rules, with a rhetorical strategy, will work only so far and then will become useless. And so the alternate to that is to have a poetic rather than a rhetoric. A rhetoric puts the emphasis on the form foot, but a poetic puts the emphasis on the flow footing. And so a poetic language is one that is always creative because its imagery is constantly shunting back and forth with memory, and each time it does this or can do this, it re-emerges fresh again. So that a poetic language, as we'll see when we get to vision and art next year, is one of the great recognitions of reality, and is the first time that the universe is inhabited by someone who is self-conscious. And the self-conscious person is really an art form who speaks in a poetic. And out of this, we'll see, comes several developments that would never have occurred in nature at all, and are truly supernatural. Whereas in the natural flow, in the mythic experience flow, the forms that come out of those two, ritual bodies and symbolic minds, whereas the ritual is suspicious of too free a flow of experience and seeks then to tame it, to control it, to rein it in, so that one can only do certain things, because if anyone and everyone could do anything and everything, we would have no stability. We would have no social forms. We would especially have no protection for the character. And we'll see when we do myth next, that the protagonist in experience is character. And it's the development of character then that seeks its stability in terms of ritual comportment. And the forms are actually forms of selected actions. These selected sequence of actions are like little snippets that are woven in such a way that they make a nest, and in that nest, then, when we have that ritual comportment woven nest, what is able to be saved in that nest will be called culture. And culture and nature, both being flows, if they are in sync, then the tradition is that the ritual is doing its job because it allows for these two forms to flow, these two flows to flow together in such a way that the ritual form is stable. We'll see, though, that the development of the mind the development of symbolic form produces a complex heightening of the dilemma, because the mind's symbol forms will be so much stronger, their integral capacity so much deeper, that it becomes a challenge to the body. And what splits the body from the mind is the fear that the mind is going to go too far, that its forms are going to be abstracted from life, and therefore it's going to be endangered, and for good reason, because the body senses in its own existentiality that the mind's forms have an instability which the body identifies as dangerous, but which the mind is confident that it can handle, and that is transformation. The mind's symbols are able to transform and to bring into play a third flow. And that third flow traditionally is called vision, consciousness. So that the body, the mind, and consciousness, which can give birth to the spirit as a person form, as an art person form. At that establishment, you then have a balance. You have three sets of a flow and a form. And there's a great stability that comes out of this. But the pair of vision and art will be differential flow, differential form, not the same as the integral forms of nature and body, myth and mind. We're looking at two women, starting today, who are a 1-2 punch, ending the 19th century and beginning the 20th century. And it is a startling thing to realize the difficulties that come out of this. We're taking Jessie L. Weston and Ruth Benedict. Jessie L. Weston was born in 1850, and Ruth Benedict lived into the late 1940s, so it's 100 years between the two of them. And in that 100 years, the understanding of ritual became greatly increased because of the study, as we have seen, the comparative study of primordial peoples, of anthropology especially. And a lot of this was triggered by the looking at the Aborigines in the United States. To some extent, the Aboriginal populations of Brazil, or of Australia, or later on of Africa, but it was the study of the primordiality of the American Indians in the 19th century that began to introduce a quality of comparative comparisons of different ways of doing rituals, comparisons of different forms of culture, and one of the great achievements of this was Ruth Benedict's book, Patterns of Culture, that came out in 1934. But the patterns of culture for Ruth Benedict in 1934 is a very complex level where the ritual snippets have been reworked and reworked so that they are no longer able very easily to be natural, to go back to nature. The indigenous people for whom the rituals are simply done are very natural, but the people studying those people who are natural are abstractly distant, and it proved to be an almost insurmountable problem. Perhaps the greatest achievement is by 1950, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Wittgenstein, loved to talk about the virtues of silence, of not speaking. And finally, J.S. Bell did a little physics monograph called The Speakable and the Unspeakable in Quantum Mechanics. And largely by the end of the 20th century, there was so much mystery again that very few people were able to speak eloquently about anything to do with meaning and mystery and truth and what one could really say. And so here at the beginning of the 21st century, we're taking an educational tack of pursuing a learning which in itself will always remain a flow, but it will be the kind of flow that a ribbon will have, and that if you twist the ribbon, you don't interrupt the ribbon, you don't interrupt the flow, but you create a form in the flow. And just a slight adjustment that you can make a circle of a ribbon with a single twist into a Mobius strip. And you will have a complementarity that has a mobile polarity within it. And this, of course, is the symbol that we use for our education, our learning, the infinity sign, the Mobius strip. Now, there are many other things that can be done with it. One is, in the 21st century, we now understand that Mobius strip can have iterative resonances that both bring in an integral way and also radiate out in a differential way all kinds of dimensions other than just time and space. That consciousness forms a dimension all of its own, and that forms can receive consciousness as a dimension to them, and they become transformable on every level: physiological, vital, mental, even vision itself. We start with Jessie L. Weston. She lived from 1850 to 1928. And Ruth Benedict was born in 1888, but she really, she didn't get started until quite a bit later in her life. She was born in New York City. Jessie L. Weston, her father had to marry 3 times. His first 2 wives died in very short times. And altogether, the 3 women gave him 10 children. And so she grew up in this marvelously complex household, and everyone but her married. All of her brothers and sisters married, but Jessie never married. She was an extraordinary child, and it was decided not to school her at home, where Victorian English girls, if they were given an education, they usually were just schooled at home. She was sent to some very good schools, and she was too brilliant for those very good schools, and she learned that she will just do it her own way. And so Jessie L. Weston became one of the classic aggressive women about taking care of their independence and protecting it, but did it with such charm and such intelligence and such capability that she always was known by either Jessie L. Weston or Laidlaw, was her middle name, or JLW. And people would prize the chance to have a visit with her and have some light tea and Grail talk with the great Jessie L. Weston. And many times in her career, she would become very famous, and then the critics would reduce her to being a complete outlaw. How could she possibly believe these things? How could anyone believe them? And then she would return with another new book, and she seesawed back and forth between being an independent auteur who was just parading her own intelligence, and on the other hand, of being one of the greatest minds of that whole era. She didn't publish until she was 44 years of age. And she suddenly burst on the scene. She had received a very nice income from her father's estate, so she always had a London place, but she liked best her Paris place. And then there was a family home in Bournemouth on the English southern coast. Or she would spend a lot of time traveling and going around. But her mentors in Paris, one of them was named Gaston Paris, and he was one of the early folklorists. And the other was Alfred, who was also a folklorist. And so she fell in with the two men in Paris that she really began to learn that there was a tremendous churning going on in the world at this time in the 1870s, 1880s, just about the time that anthropology was beginning to really delve into things. The study of folklore, of fairy tales and folklore, began to, especially in the European scene, anthropology is more the influence in the American scene, but in the European scene, it was at that time folklore. One of the figures who was very close to her, William Yeats, W.B. Yeats, his little book on Irish fairy and folk tales, and dedicated here to, inscribed to my mystical friend, G.R., which is George Russell, who didn't like to use his name, and he used the initials A.E. And here in 1918, The Candle of Vision by A.E. A.E. because of the first two letters of Aeon, that he was a cosmic spirit. And he was not just George Russell, but he was the visionary spirit A.E. And that by 1918, a whole new ethos had come into play. And part of that ethos was because the folklore development for about 30, 40 years began to challenge the ritual authority of Christianity. It became a cause célèbre at the time, because one began to see that the ritual substrate of culture can be looked at from a purely folklore standpoint. And one sees through the Christian standpoint. And the focus of this then became the Grail. Was the Grail a Christian symbol, or was the Grail a vegetarian year god renewal folklore symbol? And there were camps on both sides, and Jessie L. Weston was the one who went deepest into the realization that there is a ritual basis to all of this, which includes both the folklore and the Christian, and many others, in fact. And so it is Jessie L. Weston whose book, From Ritual to Romance, that we're going to use as one of our books to pair together with Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture. From Ritual to Romance is 1920, Cambridge University Press, and Patterns of Culture 1934. Just 14 years later, there's a world of difference between them. And we'll be able to appreciate this amazing world of difference. From Ritual to Romance, when it was first published by Cambridge University Press, this is the first edition. If one would look at most of the books that Cambridge University Press would have published in 1920 that were scholarly books, they would have been beautifully bound with gold stamp printing. This was rather tawdry bound and just stamped with green ink, because they were uncertain. They knew that her scholarship was impeccable, but what she was doing, she was showing that Christianity is not necessary to understand the ritual basis of the life of the time, and that the European culture at that time had just emerged from the First World War, and the whole thrust of what Jessie L. Weston and her crowd, her talented group of people, had done for about 20 or 30 years was all of a sudden déclassé, was out of touch. After the First World War, no one wanted to have the sweet little books that they used to make. This was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, translated by Jessie L. Weston in a little series called the Arthurian Romances that are unrepresented in Mallory's Morte d'Arthur. And she would not only do Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but she would put out here a couple of volumes, 1 and 2, of Tristan and Isolde. Also in the series were 4 tales. They're called lays in French, 4 lays of Marie de France. Marie de France is a 12th century writer who did all these wonderful tales. Here is a University of Georgia Press, Marie de France, the lays of text and context. And there are many studies now. They were all new at the time when Jessie L. Weston and her coterie were doing them. And the reason for this is that there was a discovery that the folklore basis, like the early anthropology, did not have to have religion. In fact, it was better not to have religion. It was better to go back to just the primordiality of the ritual comportment, the ritual actions. What steps do they do? What sequences do they do? And so there was an emphasis on looking clearly. One would call it in the classic Asian Sanskrit Vipassana, to look at what it is that we do in the sequence that we are doing it, and that will give us the traction then in a ritual understanding. And once we have that ritual understanding, our experience will come out of that purer than it did in a controlled, false, artificial ritual. And so it became a cause célèbre from roughly the 1870s until the First World War, till 1914. The creme year was 1913. It was like all of a sudden, by 1913, the decades of genius that had gone into this whole comportment, that if we do a ritual folklore investigation carefully enough, we will stop making fictive assumptions by artificial experience, which has been generated by curtailed ritual existences, and we will have freed ourselves to become quite real, both in the flow of nature and in the flow of mythology, in the purity of the actual primordial rituals of existence and of life, and our minds then will form in symbols that are real. And Jessie Weston is one of the geniuses of this whole movement. She, very early on, by trying to follow one of the great ritual demonstrations of the 19th century, and that was the operas of Richard Wagner. Wagner, in his stupendous genius, had seen that if one tries to go back further and further, you get into this whole regression. Well, how much further back can you go? Where are the origins? They're way back. But there is a definite period of transformation from whatever there was before and whatever there is now. And that transformational period is some place where we can get a hold of it, and that place is the medieval era. That at the same time that Jacob Burckhardt's great critique that the Renaissance is a turning away from the medieval period, and it's the Renaissance that then leads to the achievement of modern civilization, there was at the very same time the realization in Wagner that we do not turn our backs on the medieval period, but rather we inhabit it with a new comprehensive quality of putting all of the rituals, all of the myths, all of the symbols with an appropriate artistic vision, and bring it all together in a master art form. So that the Wagnerian operas are not just operas, they are super art forms where everything, costume, voice, drama, movement, sets, everything was put into it. And of course, for a young genius woman like Jessie Weston, Wagner's operas began to alert her to the fact that only geniuses like Wagner could understand these things because there were no translations of most of these things. They existed in rare manuscripts in very rare libraries, and you had to have special permission just to go and see them. And so her first book that she published was a translation in 2 volumes of one of the earliest versions of the Parsifal. And it's called Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach. And she published it in 1894. And it was suddenly a cause célèbre. And overnight, Jessie Weston became one of the most famous littérateurs, not just in England, but because she was educated largely and lived largely in Paris and traveled all over the continent. Everyone knew of her. She suddenly became the star. And a couple of years later, she would publish a large book called The Legends of the Wagner Opera, where she would take the reader patiently through and show them that this was a series of works that add up to a comprehensive re-inhabiting of the medieval ritual ethos and bringing it current into a new scale of personality, a new scale of person, a new quality of experience. And of course, Wagner, being an extraordinary genius, had gone back to the primordial ritual model of the theater in the first place. He went all the way back to Aeschylus. The maker of Greek tragedy was the founder of the way in which ritual drama can be evolved, keeping its primordiality intact so that its rituals are really existentially drawn instantly out of nature, but are of such a transformative quality that they're able to go into the mind, and that the mental symbols in their objectivity also have a primordiality. And Aeschylus is a deep source for Wagner. Later on in the 20th century, Eugene O'Neill tried to write his plays by going back to Aeschylus in exactly that way. What happens in Greek tragic ritual is that one wears a mask. The actor does not show their face. The actor is not important as an actor. The actor is important only as the character inhabiting the ritual comportment, the ritual actions. And it is to witness this in an audience that is cathartic. It's not because you identify with the actor, but it's that you, being exposed to this primordial ritual activity, you yourself are evoked to experience that. The ritual action is put before you, and your experience comes out of that, not out of anything else. Doesn't come out of assumptions, doesn't come out of anything else, of doctrines. And so it is instantly a wake-up, freeing process that you realize that you have a completely different basis of being real, other than what you thought you had been given. And this produces, of course, a startling realization. And we'll see later on in ritual, the nth degree of this was Euripides' Bacchae, which is a Greek tragedy about the tragedy of Greeks who had understood Greek tragedy and could no longer be at home in their own lives. And we're going to pair it with the Bacchae of Euripides, Basho's Zen travelogue, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, because this is also the experience in East Asia that culminated in Zen. An instant discontinuity occurs, but you do not feel discontinuous, you feel brand new in a completely radical way. Let's take a break and come back. Let's come back. We're looking at the way in which, at the very end of the 19th century, a world order that had seemed permanent was beginning to not just crumble, but to actually fade, to evaporate. And it was the alarm in every level of life that produced the Victorian defense that this is not possible. This can't be. There must be something wrong somewhere. And as the world began to experience this evaporation, the 19th century ended in such a peculiar quality that the early 20th century had an almost surreal effect to it. And the final statement about the evaporation of civilization came in 1922 when T.S. Eliot published The Wasteland. But before The Wasteland, in the midst of the looming First World War, T.S. Eliot wrote a caustic, classic poem called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, whose first lines, "The evening lays like a patient etherized on its table. Shall I roll my socks?" And it was a quality of surreality that began to produce Dada in art, along with the First World War in geopolitics, along with the end of the progressive movement in the United States, with the crumbling of the folklore quality in research, and all of a sudden you had a completely different ethos. If you were to take a photograph of the British gentleman in London in 1913, he would be wearing a top hat, and he would be in beautiful formal clothes, waiting under gaslight for a carriage to take him to his gentleman's club or a night of the theater. And 3 years later, that world was gone forever. You would have seen that figure in military uniform looking gazed and glazed, and the first automobiles evident everywhere, and a completely different tone. It came as a rude awakening. In 1913, the culmination of decades of patient work, of excellence, and we're talking about a group of people like the young E.Y. Evans Wentz, W.B. Yeats, A.E., Jessie L. Weston, Gilbert Murray. On the continent, there were experts, Gaston Paris. We've talked about Alfred Nutt, the great Kuno Meyer. All of a sudden you had this apex in 1913, and the crème de la crème, the pièce de résistance, was G.R.S. Mead's Quests, Old and New. It was published London, G. Bell and Sons, 1913. Quests, Old and New, and exactly at the very same time, at the very same place, The Quest of the Holy Grail by Jessie L. Weston, published again, G. Bell and Sons in London, 1913. They were published at the very same time. They were published together in tandem. J.R.S. Mead had been, as a brilliant young man, the last private secretary for Madame Blavatsky. When she was doing her secret doctrine in 3 great huge volumes, and her Isis Unveiled in 2 huge volumes, to show that there was a secret wisdom tradition everywhere in the world that was rising again and was going to produce a new kind of humanity. And she had founded the Theosophical Society, not philosophical, but theosophical. the wisdom of God was going to be brought through again. And this time it was going to transform the entire world in a gorgeous way. And G.R.S. Mead, after Madame Blavatsky died, began using his genius, and he investigated almost every tradition in the world with great genius. He realized that the key to the Renaissance had been not just the bringing of Plato back into focus, instead of just having an Aristotelian scholasticism, but a Platonic understanding of wisdom development in the dialogue forms, and that in the Renaissance the key had been to see that there was a Pythagorean root to Plato, and there was a Hermetic flowering from that root through Plato. And so G.R.S. Mead spent years researching and translating, and he brought out a great big huge 3 green volumes, larger than this, called Thrice Greatest Hermes. It was not just a translation again of the Hermetic treatises like Ficino had done for Cosimo de' Medici at the start of the Florentine Renaissance. He finished his translations of the Hermetic corpus in time so that he could read them to his patron Cosimo de' Medici before he died in 1464. So Mead brought all of this back and made commentaries on it and showed that there was something here in huge wisdom traditions. And then he brought out a volume called Fragments of a Faith Forgotten, all of the old Gnostic documents that had been weeded out. He brought back the Pistis Sophia and did a translation, one of the major documents of early Christianity, in which the protagonist is not a priest, but is someone who enters into the deeper Pythagorean, the wider Hermetic expansions, the Hermetic differentiation and the Pythagorean integral. And in the Pistis Sophia, the priest and the doctrine are replaced by a wisdom teacher who shows by demonstration how one goes into a dialogue of language and opens that language up so that it has an exfoliation like a flower, petal upon petal, world without end. And with the Pistis Sophia by Mead, with the Fragments of a Faith Forgotten by Mead, with the Thrice Greatest Hermes by Mead, with a book on Plotinus, with a book on Orpheus, Mead was bringing back the worldwide wisdom tradition. And he had a magazine called The Quest. And so Quest's Old and New are his articles from the Quest over the previous 4 years. And he says in here, in the preface, all the studies or sketches in this volume are illustrative of the quest of reality, the search for truth, or the restless striving of the human soul for the satisfaction of its needs, spiritual or philosophical, mystical or psychical. The subjects are gleaned from the past and present, from east and west, and all of them, each in their different ways, seem to the writer to be of deep interest and great importance, even though some are little known and may appear on first acquaintance somewhat strange. So you had for the very first time a massive application of the comparative cultures of the new anthropology, of the comparative rituals of the new folklore, being transformed and transferred to the study of wisdom on the planet. And not only quests new and old, announcing this in 1913, right at the apex of this movement, just before the First World War broke. 1 year before it broke, the quest of the Holy Grail was in an expansion of the quests old and new by G.R.S. Mead, the Quest series. And the first volumes include Psychical Research and Survival, The Quest of the Holy Grail by Jessie L. Weston, Jewish Mysticism by L. Abelson, Buddhist Psychology, C.A.F., that's Carolyn Rise Davids, The Mystics of Islam, R.A. Nicholson. So you had all of a sudden classics on world mystical spirituality showing that each religion had a kind of a hermetic vision within it that had been obviated by false ritual. And that now the revelation was that all religions have a shared mystical visionary capacity for differential expansion and also for an ancient taproot that goes back to a transformative integral. And in this, in Jessie L. Weston's quest for the Holy Grail, she takes the Grail quest as the archetype of the whole questing pattern of the way in which rituals occur in their highest form of integral. And the quest becomes then the archetypal journey of re-establishing what steps do we do, what sequences do we follow, what rituals do we engender fresh from nature, fresh from the primordiality of the universe, so that our rituals will be exactly new and right for the first time, perhaps ever, certainly for the first time since ancient, very ancient times, and the culmination of the quest for the Holy Grail by Jessie L. Weston came 7 years later with the publication of From Ritual to Romance, where she goes back and she shows with great learned and great literary flair that the Grail can be seen exactly 50-50 as a Christian symbol and as a folklore symbol, as something that comes from primordial vegetation gods and cycles, or from the earliest Christian cycles. And it can be seen like a jacquard pattern either way, equally. And that the obvious lesson of this is that there is some kind of a mystery that has happened and is still happening and going on, that if you look at it as a vegetation cycle, if you look at it from the standpoint of food, then it is something which is just completely natural. But if you look at it from the symbol standpoint, then it obviously has a completely different, it has a mind focus. So that the rituals are of a body focus, the symbols are of a mind focus, and what is one to do with this? J.R.S. Mead, in Quests Old and New, in a section, is the first one to bring out that this is not just a European mystery. It's not just a Christian mystery. It's not just a Western mystery. This is a condition of mysteriousness for the entire nature of man. And he says, I have been struck somewhat by a certain similarity between the main trend of thought in a recent phase of Occidental philosophy and the outcome of a remarkable tendency of doctrine in the centuried development of one great form of an Oriental religion. On the one hand, we have, and he mentions Bergson, Henri Bergson, who was the great philosopher of that time, not just in France or Europe, but everywhere in the world. Bergson was about understanding that time is not at all a calibration of sequences of anything. Time is not a form, but is a creative process. It is a duration, a creative duration, and that understanding this produces a different quality of understanding. And all this is fresh and new, and G.R.S. Mead is saying, on the one hand, we have Bergson in the West leading the way with a series of important publications whose chief object is to establish the thesis that reality must be sought for essentially in movement, life, spirit, regarded as a perpetual becoming, and that too by means of an insight or intuition superior to the range of the practical intellect. On the other, we have Suzuki. This is the young D.T. Suzuki. From the Far East, bringing his treatise on what he calls progressive or a Catholic Buddhism to an end in the remarkable formula, nirvana is samsara. In other words, reality is the ever-becoming. So that it's like the ribbon with a twist in it. One has a form that occurs mid-flow, and both occurs and unoccurs without disrupting the flow and without impairing the form. So that one then has a constant transform that occurs all the time. And so you have this mysterious thing of forms that occur in the midst of the flow. And if one then looks at human beings as forms in that way, you get a completely different understanding. She says in here, 1913, as a brief summary of the controversy, is the Grail Christian or is it vegetarian pagan? As a brief summary of the controversy, we may say that till within the last 6 or 7 years, scholars were divided into two sharply opposed camps. The one held that the Grail story was a purely Christian ecclesiastical legend, the work of monkish compilers, its starting point being the tradition of Joseph of Arimathea and his connection with the vessel of the Last Supper, used later as a saint relic. From this germ, all later developments, however complex, proceeded. The advocates of the opposing theory maintained that the Grail, far from being a Christian relic, was simply the automatic food-providing talisman of popular tradition, and as such a purely folklore, preferably Celtic origin. This latter view, in one form or another, is really the older. And then she cites a couple of 19th century scholars who are not read anymore. But as she published this in 1913, the First World War descended. Her entire coterie were stunned beyond belief because instead of there being a gorgeous revealing of a new kind of humanity, there was this regression back almost to a demonic imbecility. But instead of retreating, Jessie Weston stepped up the odds, and she went further back. She realized if one goes back, you have to go back before the Celts. You have to go back, and there is such a thing as, in the beginning of her book, it's called The Task of the Hero. And the star of the task of the hero began as Sir Gawain. And she found, not only translating Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in 1896, she did The Legend of Sir Gawain, Studies upon its Original Scope and Significance, 1897. But by the time of 1920, and she had spent 40 years or more investigating, she found that Gawain is not at all just an Arthurian figure. He's not at all just a Celtic figure. That he goes back, in fact, back to a figure in the Near East of Adonis, Adonis, Osiris, Tammuz. It goes back to the beginnings of Egyptian and Sumerian civilization. He is, in fact, a sun god hero that goes back before civilizations are made 6,000 or 7,000 years ago already. So that he goes back to a Neolithic primordiality that had everything to do with taming plants and animals and human nature in the first place out of a Paleolithic wildness. That the crisis was that human beings, like ourselves, had lived ever since our species emerged. We now know that Homo sapiens sapiens emerged about 150,000 years ago in the first. And there were enough of us about 120,000 years ago that the species began to make its mark on the planet. But there was never a time when we were not in the Paleolithic until about 10,000 years ago. And the Paleolithic shifted to the Neolithic, the Old Stone Age to the New Stone Age. And what characterized the New Stone Age was, for the first time, man tamed plants. Man tamed animals. Man tamed himself. And you began to have the beginnings of villages, the beginnings of tribes, the beginnings of raising food, the beginning of raising animals, the beginnings of raising human beings to fit into this pattern of controlling by selection. And instead of following the animals in their migrations, one learned to pen them up and to breed them and by selection improve them. Instead of just gathering the wild berries to begin improving them. So the beginnings of the genetic and the animal husbandry and also the social experiments with ourselves. So that the Neolithic was this crash tidal wave of that man is able to make himself. He is able to remake nature better than nature made it, as far as he is concerned. And so she found that one has to go back to the ritual origins on that scale, but you have to bring it forward to the era of romance. Because romance, largely romance was a French invention. Romance is the gorgeousness of this story told from the standpoint of a triumph. And from a ritual to romance, and I'll talk more about romance next week, she did a number of books and readers on it. One of the qualities that came out of this was that the First World War and the 1920s following this produced a disbelief in romance. Women in 1913 would still be wearing Mary Cassatt type painting, summer flowery gowns in their nice living rooms. And in the 1920s, they were smoking cigarettes and doing the jitterbug and never going near anything romantic, just the quip. You've come a long way, baby. By the time Ruth Benedict comes along, right on the heels of Jessie L. Weston, she is a completely different cookie. But she has the same brilliance that Jessie L. Weston had, only for her, the insight leads, finally, her final book. She did Patterns of Japanese Culture, and the title is The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. The polarity is lethal. The chrysanthemum is a nice emblem for the clan, for the Japanese ritual world, but it is preserved by the sword, the samurai sword. In order for there to be a ritual safe that we can trust, we have to make sure that it is defended everywhere that it could be threatened with a vehicle. And so it became apparent by 1946 when this came out. This came out at the end of the Second World War, like Jessie L. Weston's book came out at the end of the First World War. They came to radically different conclusions. One of the most difficult things in the post-Second World War era is races. And here, Ruth Benedict, 1943, in the, this is the 1943 edition. She wrote it just at the beginning, 1940. It's called Race, Science, and Politics. And it's all about the developments that have happened now, that the ritual comportment has gone into defending on levels of gender, on levels of race, as well as religion, as well as politics. And so we have a world that is becoming fractured in such a way that human beings are only safe if they stay on their own little fractured compartment. One of the most brilliant characterizations of it at the time was by Simone de Beauvoir, and she said, New York City is the perfect tyranny. You're free to go as high as you want as long as you stay on your block. You can have a 110-story building, but don't go across the street. And so Ruth Benedict did a little book called In Henry's Backyard. It's a children's book, The Races of Mankind. Henry, a stock-sized citizen of one shrinking world, had a wonderful dream. He dreamed that the whole world was living in his own backyard. When he woke the next morning, he looked out the window and found that it was true. Now, Henry was a friendly fellow. His first impulse was to rush out and shake hands with his new neighbors, and these new neighbors seemed to feel the same way about it. But when they made the mistake of looking at the outside of each other, up popped their green devils. Henry, the white man, had a green devil. Each yellow man had a green devil. Each black man had a green devil. All the green devils shouted, but we're all different. What happened to these green devils and to the people in whom they lurked makes up the action of this amusing book. A little chat on race, a little chat on the ritual comportment. Where Ruth Benedict got started was characteristic. She went to the Southwest, like Gladys Reichard that we talked about for the first 4 weeks of Ritual. And one of her first publications there, Tales of the Cochiti Indians, published by the Smithsonian Institution, the Bureau of American Ethnology. Then she brought out Patterns of Culture. This is 1931. This is 1934. And in 1935, her magnum opus, Zuni Mythology, in 2 big volumes. And in Zuni Mythology, she says, right away in the introduction, before her study gets started, no folk tale is generic. It is always the tale of one particular people with one particular livelihood and social organization and religion. The final form that a tale takes in that culture is influenced, often fundamentally, by attitudes and customs that cannot be discovered except with full knowledge of life and behavior amongst that people. It has always been obvious, so that one has to give oneself over to living that life of those people. It's an old saying, American Indian saying, never criticize someone unless you have walked a mile in their moccasins. But what came out of this, the Zuni and the Cochiti, they're Pueblo peoples, but the Zuni are especially infamous. They are the Pueblo people who most did not want to change anything ever. They were very much like the Orthodox Jews who made sure after the Council of Jamnia in 90 AD that the Masoretic text of the Torah would not ever be changed. And one can look at a Masoretic text of 2004. It is exactly the same, every iota, every accent, as the one decided upon in Jamnia in 90 AD, which is exactly the time that the Hermetic treatise, the Poimandres, was written. And they are completely opposite. They are completely 2 different things. The one says, we will make sure by ritual that nothing ever changes, so we can trust that it will always be exactly what it is. Whereas the other says it needs to be fluid and change all the time, because that is what is real. And if we don't change, then life will eventually back up and refuse to flow through us. And we will die. So there are 2 completely opposing qualities centered around ritual. Do you keep it exactly, precisely the same by refining the codes and the laws to every little niggling detail? Or do you open it up so that it flows again and comes back through? And Ruth Benedict became the primary figure in trying to alert a very large population of people that this century that started with people like Jessie L. Weston, by the end of the Second World War, that the situation had become intolerable to keep it a secret anymore. It wasn't just for academics or refined people or learned people, but Patterns of Culture reached millions of people. And she, in Patterns of Culture, takes 3 completely different ways to be human. And she shows that the Pueblos of New Mexico are totally different from the Dobu who live on this island, and they are different indeed from the Kwakiutl Indians in the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest, the Northwest, and New Guinea. And the Dobuans amply deserve the character they are given by their neighbors. They are lawless and treacherous. Every man's hand is against every other man. They lack the smoothly working organization of the Trubians, headed by honored high chiefs and maintaining peaceful and continual reciprocal exchanges of goods and privileges. The Dobu has no chiefs. It certainly has no political organization. In a strict sense, it has no legality. And this is not because the Dobuan lives in a state of anarchy, Rousseau's natural man, as yet unhampered by the social contract, but because the social forms which can obtain in Dobu put a premium upon ill will and treachery, and make of them the recognized virtues of their society. So in the midst of the 30s, when all kinds of movements were happening all over the world, you had people like Hitler and FDR coming in at the same time. It's Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture that finally reaches an audience of millions of people who for the first time realized we were caught in a dilemma that is unsolvable given the situations and the techniques and the traditions that we have. There was no tradition that was going to be able to handle it because it was an intractable dilemma. It was not a problem that could be solved. It was not an issue that could be discussed. It was a dilemma that could not be endured. And right in the midst of that came the discovery that the atom has such a thing as a neutron, and that the decay of radioactivity is all linked up with the fact that atoms can be split. And the first person to realize that there could be an atomic bomb tried to take a patent out on it. His name was Leo Szilard. He was a Hungarian. And in 1934, when this came out, he tried to take a patent on atomic bombs. It was only a few years later that the thing was worked out due to a woman, Lisa Meitner, was the first one to understand, and in writing a letter to Otto Hahn in Germany, in Berlin, they understood, yes, it is possible to transform not just animals and plants and societies, we can transform the very atoms that make up the fundamental existence, so that we now are going to have to learn to control fundamental existentiality on level of atoms. So we live in a time that is 3 generations after that. And it still has not been handled appropriately at all because something fundamental was missing. What was missing all the time was an ability for our kind to learn how to learn in radical ways that did not blur the traditional wisdoms. And that's what this education is about. All the traditional wisdoms are included. None of them are obeyed. All of them are respected, but brought into a living kaleidoscope. There is such a thing as a Mobius strip that is kaleidoscopic. And that's what this is. More next week.